Welcome. Thank you for coming out during this really bad weather. It's similar to weather that George Washington and Christopher Gist faced here in western Pennsylvania back on December 28th and 29th of 1753. You're coming out today in this cold, cold weather with ice and snow is kind of like John Crawford, the first settler in Richland, except he really was in Pine. In fact, most of you know, I'm sure, that Richland Township didn't even exist until 1862, and that Bakerstown was in Deer Township. But anyway, I appreciate your coming out like those early settlers coming out here facing many travails. My name is Paul White. I'm the president of the Richland History Group. And we are proud to present this free program to the community, Colonial Western Pennsylvania, including Washington's 1753 trek through Richland Township. We've brought together 3 outstanding speakers, none of whom knew each other until they met here just now. I want to advise you that we are videotaping this for many, many different organizations who have asked that we do that. So just keep that in mind with your decorum, which I'm sure will be outstanding. After each one of our speakers speaks from the podium here, they will ask a couple of questions. And what I ask of you is, because it is being recorded on a camcorder, try to speak up. But if not, I've asked the speakers to repeat the question. That's not so much for you, but more for the video. Our first 2 speakers will present. We'll have a short restroom refreshment break, and then our keynote speaker will speak. And at the end of the program, we'll have time for more questions that the panel will take. You can approach them by name individually with your question, or just throw it open to the table. Our first speaker is a teacher of great humility. When I asked him what his credentials were, he told me that he was a teacher. It's customary with historical societies to kind of lay it on with your credentials. And our first speaker has many, I'm sure, but he's very, very humble. I went to the Pine Richland School District and asked Rachel Hawthorne, the communications director for the district, to pick one faculty member from the Pine Richland School District who would best represent them at this program. And it didn't take long for her to get back to me after she had reached out to the academicians in the district and got back very quickly and said it was unanimous. Our first speaker is chosen. So even though he's extremely humble, he's extremely well regarded. He's a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, and he's taught U.S. history in the district for 20 years. Today he's going to address George Washington, his life, and his accomplishments, and whatever else he would like about George Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Eric Brown.
Well, good afternoon. First off, I'd like to thank Mr. White and the Richland History Group for holding this event, and I'd like to thank you for coming out today and showing your interest in such important topics. As Mr. White said, my name is Eric Brown. I've been teaching 20 years at Pine Richland Middle School, and the main focus of our curriculum at Pine Richland Middle School is the French and Indian War and the events that surround it. We are very fortunate as Pennsylvanians to have a great history in our state, and to have so many events that shaped our country's direction. But we're also very fortunate to have direct connections to events that have shaped George Washington. As I like to tell my students, George Washington cut his teeth here in Western Pennsylvania. My objective this afternoon is to give some insight into George Washington's early years and a brief summary of the events in Western Pennsylvania that led to and were part of the French and Indian War. Many of these events could be talked about for hours, but I'm going to try to consolidate 4 of those events into a timely manner. So I got probably about a little over 20 minutes to talk about these 4 events. So I'm going to be skipping over some details, but again, at the end, if you have any questions for me, please ask. Let's begin. Let's see. There we go. Well, usually when we think of George Washington, we think of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, or we think of George Washington as President of the United States. But once again, we should look at him as a young man. And what really drove this young man? What was his objectives? What was his goals as a 19-year-old man? So if we look at this next slide, we see a little image of George Washington as a 19-year-old man in Virginia. George Washington, unfortunately, his father died when he was a relatively young man. But George Washington did have an older brother. His name was Lawrence Washington, 14 years older than him. And Lawrence was what George Washington wanted to be. Lawrence was in the British military. Lawrence was a commander of the Virginia militia, and Lawrence married into a wealthy family, the Fairfax family. And when George Washington looked at him, he wanted to be like him. I mean, I can relate to that. I have 2 older brothers, and there are many things that they did that I wanted to emulate. And Lawrence Washington was that individual George Washington wanted to be. Well, George Washington was going to go into the British Navy, but his mother said no. And this was on the advice of Lawrence, but it didn't happen. So the next thing that George Washington did as a young man was he became a surveyor. And because of his connections to the Fairfax family, he was able to go throughout the Shenandoah Valley and survey lands. And over the next 3 years, from when he was 19 to 21, he surveyed over 190 areas. Well, this is very important for George Washington because he gets experience. But he also started to see what society was like. And in this quote, it says that he wrote to his brother Jack in 1755, "I should be glad to hear you live in harmony and good fellowship with the family at Bellevore." And that means the Fairfax family. "As it is in their power to be very sensible upon many occasions to us as young beginners. To that family under many obligations." He realized it was good to have benefactors, people that will watch and over you to help you move through society. And at this moment, George Washington realized that you can move up in society by being a member of the British military. So George Washington was thinking to himself, I want to become a British officer, but I need someone to give me a commission. And I also need an opportunity to prove myself. And luckily, that opportunity will come about for George Washington. Now I would like to show you how this comes about, because in the late 1740s and the early 1750s, there started to be a dispute in the area that is circled here, which is where we are today, the Ohio country. The French are up in New France, but they have trading posts throughout the Great Lakes in the Illinois country, and all the way down in Louisiana. And they wanted to start to consolidate this area, start to make it more efficient. And the best way to do that is to control this area, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio River. They weren't going to settle it, they just wanted to continue with the trade with the Native Americans of that territory. Well, the British, though, they're hemmed in on the eastern coast. By this time, they're doubling their population every 20, 25 years, and they wanted to go over the Appalachian Mountains into this territory. And really, it was the Pennsylvanians and the Virginians that really eyed this area as a prize. And both sides didn't want the other one to have it. As we know, prior to this, the French and the British were fighting wars for many, many decades prior to the 1750s. Well, the British are already coming into this territory, as I said before, mainly Pennsylvania traders, and they're disrupting the relationship between the French and the Indians of this territory. So much so that in 1749, they send out an expedition led by Céloron de Blainville to come into this territory and lay claim to it again by burying lead plates at various river sources. They go into Indian villages to remind them of their French father and that the duty that they have to him, and also to intimidate them. But that doesn't really work that well. By 1752, the Virginians start to come into this territory, and they're led by the Ohio Company, which is a group of Virginians who see this territory as a place to start to settle it, and they wanted to make money off of it. One of the shareholders of that Virginia company, the Ohio Company, was Robert Dinwiddie. Robert Dinwiddie was one of their shareholders. So they send a group of men there to meet up with the Iroquois representative that represents them in the Ohio country. And his name was Tanner Grissom. But they also went by Half King. And Half King signed an agreement with the Ohio Company to start to build in the Ohio country. Now you might ask yourself, why is that? Why would he want people, white settlers, to start to build in that area? And I can give you two reasons. One is that he needed to shore up his leadership with his men and women of that area. And the best way to do that was to buy them off. So the Ohio Company brought him gifts, and he was going to use that to buy off his followers. And secondly, the French disrespected him in an earlier meeting, and he hated the French, so he sided with the British. Now we'll hear about Half King again a little bit later. So the French hear about these events, and they react. In 1752, they start to build a number of forts in western Pennsylvania. The first one being Fort Presque, which is Erie, PA today. The second one's going to be Fort LeBoeuf, which is where Edinburgh University is today. The third one was going to be Fort Michault, which is where Franklin, PA today. And what's interesting about that, there was a trader there named John Fraser. He was a British trader. They kicked him out. They took over his trading post, and then they made it into a fort. He had to flee. And then the fourth fort was going to be at the Forks of the Ohio. But due to the lateness of the season, they didn't get to it. They didn't get to it. Now here comes the opportunity for George Washington. Because Robert Dinwiddie hears about this, and he's looking for a man to deliver a letter to the French up at Presque Isle to tell them this is a British territory. So George Washington comes onto the scene. You might ask yourself, why George Washington? Why did Robert Dinwiddie choose him? Well, we can break it down to two reasons. One, he was talented. He had experience in the backcountry of Virginia. He's ambitious, and he's willing to do it. Secondly, his connections to the Fairfaxes. Colonel William Fairfax was a powerful figure in Virginia politics. So Dinwiddie sensed that and says, okay, I got a guy, let's use him. And George Washington is going to make a trip all the way up to Fort LeBoeuf, deliver a letter, and come back. Our presenter here today is going to talk about that trip, so I'm going to skip over that here. She might dispute that map, and we'll find out later on. But that is the trip that he makes to Fort LeBoeuf and on the way back. Well, when he gets back, Robert Dinwiddie convinces George Washington to publish his journals, and he does, and they actually get published in Britain too. So he becomes well known in the colonies as well as Britain. He gets his 15 minutes of fame, and he gets a promotion. Robert Dinwiddie says, okay, I need you to build a road from Virginia all the way to Redstone Creek, which is a tributary of the Monongahela. While he's doing that, Dinwiddie is already ahead of the game. He's sending Virginians to the point to build Fort Prince George, and they do so. However, the French come down in 1754 on the Allegheny, and they plant themselves across the way from the point with 600 Marines and militia and their Indian allies. The Virginians see what's ahead of them, and they're concerned. They come over and basically say, we'll let you go. You can leave. You can take your flag. You can take your supplies. You can take your men and leave. Otherwise, we will attack and you will lose. The Virginians are looking at themselves probably thinking, yeah, this sounds like a good deal. But Half King was there. Half King tries to instigate a fight. He wants the British to fight because if the British don't fight, Half King has to leave. Him and his followers are going to have to leave that area because he set up his alliance with the British. He has to leave. He throws a tantrum, but the Virginians says, we're leaving, and they take off. But Half King will come on to another event later on. So they start to leave, and the French build Fort Duquesne, right? But George Washington is still building the road. So George Washington is building this road that he was ordered to do. He knows what happens at the forks. By being the good soldier he is, he continues to build the road. While the French, with their Indian allies, know that George Washington's in the territory that they now claim as theirs. So they send out a detachment from Fort Duquesne, led by Ensign Jumonville. And they're going to basically confront George Washington and say, what are you doing in our territory? You're not allowed to be here. Well, as this is going on, Half King comes back into the scene. He sends a group of his tribe to George Washington and says, hey, about 5 to 10 miles from where you're at right now is a group of French soldiers. We could take you there. So in the morning, on the night of May 27th and the morning of May 28th, George Washington with his Indian allies and Half King surround the French in this area right here. This is the actual spot right now that we're looking at. The French are getting up, they're eating their breakfast, they're getting dressed, and then there's a short skirmish. 15-minute skirmish, it's over. George Washington says this in his journal, I ordered my company to fire. We killed Mr. Jumonville, the commander of that party, and also 9 others. Well, he doesn't tell you what happens afterwards. Because when the skirmish is over, those Frenchmen were alive. George Washington gets a letter, and he's trying to read it. All right, but it's in French. He's having difficulty with it. And Half King comes up and behind Jumonville and slams his hatchet into his head and kills him. He says, thou art not yet dead, my father. That's a diplomatic phrase there, because he's extinguishing the father. They called the French the father. And he says, you're basically saying you're extinguished. I don't follow you in this area. But you have to understand, Half King was trying to instigate the British to fight. If the British don't fight, he loses his power. He loses his status. He needed the British to fight. He thought that if he instigated it, they would rise to the occasion and win the day. Well, George Washington doesn't write about that in his journal. And we have to remember, why would that be? Well, because he's trying to prove himself. He has to prove that he's worthy of a commission in the British Army. So he's not going to write about something that doesn't make him look good. We all can relate to that. So word gets back to the French because one Frenchman actually escapes and gets back and tells them that Jumonville was alive after the incident. But the French realize that Jumonville was killed. There's a coincidence that his brother was in camp, and he wants revenge on it. He wants to get revenge for the death of his brother. So George Washington knows this is going on. By being the good soldier he is, he continues to build a road to Redstone Creek. But word gets to him that the French are on their way. He decides to build a fort. He called it Fort Necessity. It's not to fight behind. He's just storing some goods in there. You know, he plans on fighting in the open field. So he clears out the area. It's a great meadow. He thinks he's going to fight a European-style battle. But by July 3rd, 1754, they're approaching. George Washington writes in his journal, I shall not fear the attack of 500 men. Well, we always try to show bravery, right, by saying words like that. Well, he's going to fight a force of over 500 men. He thinks he's going to fight it in the open field. As Robert Griffin, who was a local artist, a Richland artist, drew this painting, or painted the painting, he comes out and was going to fight in the open. But the Indians don't fight that way, who are with the French. So they take cover in the forest, and they start bombarding George Washington with fire and his men. So they have to retreat back into the fort, and there's a image of that. And this is an 8-hour-long battle. The rain starts coming. George Washington is in the thick of it. It's a difficult situation. But by the end of the day, the French ask for surrender. George Washington looks at this as a godsend. Yes, well, what are they offering? Well, the translation's not good. It's dark. People are tired. The pressure's on George Washington, and he decides to sign the agreement. He gets to take most of his men home with him. Only a few prisoners are going to go with the French. They destroy the fort. George Washington gets back to Virginia. But in the document, it says that George Washington assassinated Jumonville. Now we know that if George Washington knew that's what it said, he wouldn't have signed the document. We say, well, how does that hurt? Does that hurt George Washington's reputation? Well, the French commander in North America, General Duquesne, identified Washington as the epitome of dishonor. But back in Virginia, the House of Burgesses passed a resolution recognizing George Washington and his officers. It says this: we recognize their bravery for their late gallant and brave behavior in defense of their country. So it didn't really hurt his reputation at that point. However, the House of Burgesses decided not to fund the regiment anymore, so they would consolidate it. George Washington was not going to take the dishonor of losing his rank, so he retired. He went back to his farm. Now that is 1754. Because of that event, and this is the image down at the Heinz History Center of George Washington reading the surrender document. Here's a nice map of what the events I'm talking about right now. So what happens, though, we're going to talk about the Braddock campaign right now. 1755, the British hear about the disaster of Fort Necessity. They hear about the Albany Congress not working. It was an opportunity for the colonies to come together to repel the French. It didn't work out. So they send over General Braddock. General Braddock's going to force the colonies to work together. He's going to lead an expedition from Virginia all the way to the forks of the Ohio and take on the French. Fate looks upon George Washington once again. General Braddock sends out one of his aides-de-camp to ask George Washington to become part of his military family. He's going to get a volunteer position and become an aide-de-camp. George Washington can't believe it, right? Because this is what he wanted. He wanted someone to, teach him about how to become a soldier. But he also wanted someone to maybe be a benefactor. Someone could give him a commission in the British Army. So George Washington leaps at this challenge, and he actually assists Braddock by suggesting that they create a flying column. It was taking a long time to get up over these mountains, and he suggested, hey, let's take our elite soldiers, let's move ahead quickly, and let the baggage follow at their own rate. Braddock takes his advice. By July 9th, 1755, they've made it over these mountains and are within the doorstep of Fort Duquesne. Below this hill on July 9th, the British Army crosses the Monongahela, and if you know where Kennywood is today, that's where they're talking about. It's right down in below Kennywood, across the river into Braddock. They start to march in there. Now the French know they're coming. They're scared because it's an overwhelming force, over 1,200 men. But the Indians don't fight for land. They're not going to fight at the fort, but they eventually convince the French to move out of the fort and attack them as they're crossing the river. And that's what they do. This is a statue of George Washington at Kennywood. And George Washington was in the thick of it that day. This is what he says. He says, the Virginia companies behaved like men and died like soldiers. I had luckily escaped without a wound, though I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot from under me. This is an image of that battle of that day. George Washington is right beside Braddock. Braddock was in the thick of it throughout the day, but during the 3-hour battle, he is shot eventually, thrown from his horse. This is a Robert Griffin painting of that day. George Washington's kneeling by General Braddock, and that's Robert Griffin right there with me. So, what is interesting about that particular event, though, is George Washington helps lead the retreat all the way back to Uniontown. They don't stop until they get all the way back to Uniontown. Braddock dies 3 days later. So his opportunity to get recognized and get a commission in the Army is gone. Now what happens over the next 3 years is that the countryside of Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania is set ablaze. The Ohio Indians side with the French, and they start hitting settlements throughout those 3 areas. George Washington is asked by Virginia, I'm sorry I skipped over, this is a statue of George Washington in Braddock today. And George Washington in the next 3 years is asked to protect the Virginia frontier. And he can't do it. The Indians are like ghosts. They hit and they leave. By the time you get there, they're gone. And he writes about that. He says, I've been posted upon cold and barren frontiers to perform, I think I may say, impossibilities. That is, to protect from the cruel incursions of a crafty savage enemy, a line of inhabitants of more than 300 miles, 50 miles, extent with a force inadequate to the task. What George Washington does benefit from, though, is he learns a great deal here. For the next 3 years, he learns about orders, he learns about discipline, he learns about recruitment, and he learns about politics, things that he's going to need in the American Revolution. But fate smiles upon George Washington again in 1758, because now the British are ready to take on Fort Duquesne again. They have new leadership in England. William Pitt comes to power. He appoints an energetic and well-qualified men like General Forbes, and General Forbes is going to lead an expedition across Pennsylvania to take on Fort Duquesne. And he asked George Washington to be a part of it. George Washington is going to lead the 1st Virginia Regiment as they march their way across Pennsylvania. But George Washington does have some issues with General Forbes and his second in command, Colonel Henry Bouquet, because they're building a road across Pennsylvania. He wanted them to take Braddock's Road, mainly because it would benefit Virginia after the war. They disagreed, but George Washington stays on and is going to be part of the event here at Ligonier. So at Fort Ligonier, George Washington goes out one day, encounters a French group that came out of Fort Duquesne, because they know that they're coming. They wanted to delay the action long enough that Forbes would go back to winter quarters. So they're out there. General George Washington splits his force. He comes across the French. He defeats them. But what happens is the second group comes around and they don't recognize one another. And they fire into each other. Now, George Washington writes about this. And I'm going to highlight the section here at the bottom. It says, George Washington never was in more imminent danger by being between two fires, knocking up with his sword the presented pieces. Now, this is George Washington talking about himself in the third person. So he rides through the two groups on his horse, knocking up the guns, and he stops them. Unfortunately, a number of his soldiers died. However, they find out that the French are in desperate need at the forks of the Ohio. The Ohio Indians have left them because of the Treaty of Easton in 1758 was signed, and they're in a desperate situation. This convinces General Forbes to continue on to Fort Duquesne. And as they march towards Fort Duquesne, the British blow it up and sail downriver. There's never a battle. There's never a battle, and that's one reason why it's kind of forgotten in the French-Indian War, because there was not a distinctive battle there. But George Washington goes home. George Washington goes home after that. He accomplished his goal of capturing Fort Duquesne, but he never gets his position in the British military. He never gets his commission. So instead of moving up in society by becoming an officer in the British Army, he moves up in society by marrying a wealthy widow. So he goes home, marries his future wife, Martha, and he becomes one of the richest men in Virginia at that point. So once again, we talked about a number of events today. We talked about the Jumonville skirmish. We talked about the Battle of Fort Necessity. We talked about the Braddock campaign and the Forbes campaign. 4 major events that a lot of people look to as starting the French and Indian War. There are people who think that the Jumonville skirmish was the event that sparked the French and Indian War. As Voltaire, a French Enlightenment writer, said, "A shot fired in the wilderness set the world ablaze." And think again, it's in our backyard. Now there's other historians like David Preston says, no, we can't forget what the French were doing. They were building forts. They took over Fort Prince George. They were instigators too. But a lot of people look at that event at Jumonville as being the beginning of the French and Indian War. Now, George Washington does come back to Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania in 1770, and he meets up with Gaius Suda. Gaius Suda was one of the people who helps him during his trip to Fort LaBeouf. And he was in this area surveying land that he owned, and he meets with him. This is a sculpture on Mount Washington. If you ever go up there, obviously it's a great view, but it's a nice sculpture too. And then he was there one more time. I'm going to summarize it. I know Mr. White wanted me to mention this, that he was here in 1794, obviously, he didn't make it to Western Pennsylvania, he made it to Bedford, PA, with the Whiskey Rebellion. And that was one of the last times that he's going to be in Pennsylvania at that time. So, George Washington, incredible individual. And again, these events was very influential in his life and helped him learn many valuable lessons. So, and that is the end. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, you may ask. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a dispute about whether Washington was the one who killed?
Drummondville?
Yeah, Drummondville.
Well, there might be a dispute who fired first, but in that regards, but most people agree that the British fired first. What is interesting that there's some other accounts that come about recently that I read that Half King, there's no dispute that Half King probably killed Drummondville, but there's some disputes whether or not Half King wanted to kill Drummondville. There was another guy who he might have been angry at. His name was LaForce, and he was looking to kill LaForce, but he hid behind Washington. So then Drummondville was probably there, and he slammed his hatchet into his head and killed him. But you know, there's no dispute that Drummondville was killed by Half King. Yes. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
Was anything else known about what became of Half King?
Yeah, well,
Can you repeat the question?
sure. He asked what it became of Half King. Well, what was interesting, I skipped over this. Right before the Battle of Fort Necessity, Half King was trying to help out George Washington to get the Ohio Indians to fight with him. All right? But the Ohio Indians refused to do so. And there's a number of reasons for it. One, they couldn't offer any goods for the Indians. Two, if they sided with the British, they would have to move their families out of that area. Three, the British have not been reliable allies at that point. And then lastly, the French were a much stronger force. So the Indians are very sophisticated. They weigh one side versus the other, and they see what is best for them. And at that point in 1754, they realized that the French were stronger. So the Ohio Indians did not fight in that battle. They did not help out. Or if they did, they fought for the French. Half King left. He died a few months later, a broken man. Yes. Great question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I heard that the reason Washington lost at Fort Necessity, besides his opposing forces being in the woods and being firing from protected positions, was that the heavy rain wetted the gunpowder that George Washington had in essentially an unprotected fort, while the Indians were more protected in the woods and their gunpowder was not wetted.
And I would agree with you. I mean, you think about that. He's out in the open. They didn't really have much coverage. And by the end of the day, the French, the one reason why the French started to look for a surrender from Washington is that there was rumors they could hear in the distance cannon fire that the British were going to be reinforcing them. And his men were tired. They were drained. They didn't have any field artillery to knock down Fort Duquesne. So they were looking to end it also. But yeah, you're correct. He was at a disadvantage that day. There's no doubt. All right. Yes, sir.
How long did the Battle of Braddock last on the Mount?
About 3 hours. The sources I've read, about 3 hours that day. And, Braddock was in the thick of it. But what really happened, and what was interesting about this, is as they were crossing the river and going into the other side, the French force was coming out, and the advance guard of the British met each other. Not head to head. There was a distance there, maybe 200 yards. And what the French advance guard did is they fired a volley into them. Now, it was at a far range, but what happened is it killed the French commander, Beaujeu. And by luck, it killed him. But what happened is allowed the Indians to react, and the Indians took control of that battle that day. They circled around them. They hid behind trees. And what the British did is they fought typically how they usually did, in lines, and they started to pick off their officers. And what happened is the militia started to hide behind trees, and they started to fire into each other. So it was total chaos in that 3 hours. Yes, sir.
George Washington had slaves.
Yes, he did.
How do we justify this?
Well, that is a good question. I think what we do today as a society, we take the values that we have as a society today and we push them on to people 250 years ago. And we say, they shouldn't have done those things. And we know that slavery, it was a terrible action. But at no time was anyone in 1776, 1789 giving up their slaves or the enslaved people. No one was giving up that power or that wealth. And George Washington does give up slaves when he dies. But again, here's a guy who had great political capital and he could have used it, but he didn't use it. There was a well-known historian, Annette Gordon Reed, who's a biographer of Thomas Jefferson, and there's a great podcast that she gave on Thomas Jefferson on his website called Ben Franklin's World. And she basically says that she says it's dishonest or inappropriate for us to judge them back then, because we always say, why didn't they do more? Well, they did quite a bit, didn't they? And for us to say, why didn't they do one more thing? One more thing. And she says there's probably not a fair assessment or question of that. But that's another discussion, and a whole that could be discussed for many, many hours in regards to that. So yes, George Washington didn't give up his slaves until his death. And remember, his wife still had her slaves. He just gave up the ones that he owned. All right. So again, thank you for your time. I know I spoke probably a little bit more than 20 minutes, but thank you for your questions. Have a good day.